The invitation did not begin with football. It began with a letter no one in Madrid wanted to answer. A Spanish king was invited back to Mexico during the 2026 World Cup, and on the surface, it looked polite. Flags, handshakes, anthems, cameras, the careful smile of diplomacy. But palaces have the talent for dressing old wounds in fresh protocol. My dear friend, when I saw that photograph from the Taman at the National Palace, I did not look first at the handshake. I looked at the room. 2 flags, 2 histories, 1 crown returning to a country that had recently refused to welcome that same king to a presidential inauguration. That is not a small detail. It is the crack in the portrait. If you stay with me, understand why a football tournament became a stage for conquest, apology, pride, money, and memory. And near the end, we will return to one uncomfortable question. Did Mexico and Spain reconcile? Or did the crown simply learn how to come back without kneeling? Before we open that file, stay close, my dear toes. The royal keeper opens these royal archives every other day. If you want the history behind the ceremony, subscribe and leave a like. It helps this file reach the ones who know a crown in the stands is never just a guest. Now, let us begin with the photograph. The photograph is almost too polite. That is what fermentates. 2 flags stand inside the National Palace in Mexico City. The Mexican flag, the Spanish flag. Between them, they face the cameras with the careful posture of people who know a single image can do the work of 100 speeches. There are anthems. There is protocol. There is the hand extended at the correct moment, held just long enough for the press, released before anyone can read too much into it. At least, that is what the room wants you to believe. I have learned to distrust rooms that behave too well, my dear friend. A room can be arranged like a confession and still pretend it is only decoration. Chairs can be placed to soften a wound. Flags can stand very still while history moves beneath them. Even a smile can be pressed into service if the palace needs it badly enough. And this room needed it, because the man in that photograph was not just a guest at a World Cup. He was the king, standing in Mexico after years in which that very crown had become a problem. Not an enemy, no. Diplomacy is rarely so honest. But a problem. A symbol that could not be received without reopening an old argument, and could not be ignored without creating a new one. That is why the invitation matters. Not because a monarch attended a football match. Kings attend matches. Presidents receive dignitaries. Cameras record handshakes. Most of the time, the ceremony passes across the screen and disappears before the next whistle. But this one did not disappear. This one carried too much weight. A Spanish king in Mexico during the 26th World Cup meant football, yes. It meant Spain's national team, a stadium in Guadalajara, and a tournament large enough to turn every gesture into a signal. But it also meant something older than FIFA, older than television, older than the modern states now arranging the photographs. It meant conquest. It meant memory. It meant a crown returning, very carefully, to a country that had spent years asking whether that crown had ever truly answered for what came before it. And here is the first small irregularity in the archive. If this were only a sporting visit, the story would be simple. A head of state is invited. A match is played. A few pleasant words are exchanged. Everyone goes home with the official version folded neatly in their luggage. But the official version does not explain why this visit was watched so closely. It does not explain why the same royal presence that could be welcomed in 2026 had been withheld from a presidential inauguration in 2024. It does not explain why a World Cup, of all things, became the place where Mexico and Spain could stand together again without pretending the past had vanished. That is the part I cannot leave alone. Some files close neatly. This one does not. Because behind that photograph sits another image. Not a stadium, not a trophy, not a smiling crowd, but a sealed letter left unanswered long enough to become a diplomatic wound. Behind the invitation sits a question neither country could fully avoid. When an unwrapped old empire is invited back into the room, what exactly is being forgiven? And perhaps more importantly, who has the right to forgive it? Before we judge the invitation, before we decide whether it was reconciliation, calculation, courtesy, or theater, we need to look around that room. Who was standing there? Who was missing? And who, after 5 centuries of history, was still expected to remain silent? Every palace room has 2 maps. One is visible. The other is the one people brought in with them. In that room, the president stood not only as head of state, but also as the heir to a political wound she did not create alone. She inherited a dispute already sharpened by her predecessor, the man who turned an old historical grievance into a modern high diplomatic test. That matters, because Mexico's president was not simply choosing whether to be polite to a European monarch. She was deciding how much of Mexico's memory could be placed on the table without breaking the table itself. And across from her stood the king. Not a conquistador, of course, not a man from the 16th century. History is more complicated than that, and I have no patience for easy theater dressed as moral clarity. But he is the King of Spain. That means he carries a crown that speaks even when he is silent. A modern constitutional monarch may not command fleets across the Atlantic. He may not sign orders for conquest or govern colonies from a throne room. But a crown has a long shadow, my dear friend. It keeps old symbols alive long after the laws have changed. That is why the king could not enter this story as an ordinary guest. He entered as a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to travel light. Then there was Jack, the man who was not in the room, but whose letter was. Mexico's former president had already left office by the time this World Cup diplomacy unfolded. But absence is not the same as disappearance. In palaces, the missing person often occupies the largest chair. His 2019 demand for recognition and apology over the abuses of the conquest had created the modern shape of the dispute. Even when his name was not spoken, his challenge remained on the table. Mexico's president inherited that challenge. The king inherited the weight of answering it. Spain inherited the difficulty of admitting enough to reopen the door, but not so much that the crown appeared to kneel. And Mexico inherited a harder problem still. How do you defend historical dignity without freezing every future conversation? This is where the room becomes crowded. Because behind the 2 heads of state stood governments, diplomats, business interests, cultural institutions, sports officials, and a World Cup large enough to turn private gestures into public signals. Spain had reasons to repair the relationship. Mexico had reasons to diversify its alliances. Both countries had economic reasons to stop letting an argument over the past poison every conversation about the present. But there was another presence in the room, the one the cameras rarely know how to frame. Mexico's indigenous peoples. Not as decoration, not as a footnote, not as a convenient moral symbol to be lifted when a speech needs gravity. They are the reason the wound could not be reduced to manners. Because the argument was never only about whether one king answered one letter. It was about what the conquest means in a country where indigenous languages are still spoken. Indigenous communities still fight for recognition. And the violence of the colonial order did not simply vanish because the empire changed its paperwork. This is where Elijah must be careful. And I will be. A good story about power should not steal suffering from the people who lived it. The palace loves doing that. It takes pain from below, wraps it in velvet, and calls it national history. So let us keep the hierarchy clear. The king mattered because he carried the crown. The president mattered because she controlled the invitation. The former president mattered because he had reopened the wound. Spain mattered because it had to choose how much of the past to acknowledge. Mexico mattered because it had to decide what kind of recognition was enough to allow the door to open. But the deepest moral weight of the story did not belong to any of them. It belonged to the people whose history made the apology matter in the first place. Now, once all of those figures are inside the room, the official version becomes easier to understand. It is clean, it is diplomatic, it is almost graceful. And that, naturally, is where we must begin to doubt it. The official story has good posture. It stands straight. It lowers its voice, removes the blood from the carpet before inviting the photographers in. In this version, the visit of the king to Mexico in 2026 was a diplomatic thaw wrapped around a football tournament. A king came to support Spain during the World Cup. A president received him with courtesy. Two countries, after years of tension, chose to look forward. There is truth in that, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. Diplomacy is not always a lie. Sometimes diplomacy is what keeps old arguments from becoming permanent walls. There are moments when nations must find a sentence both sides can survive. Not love, not forgiveness. A sentence. The official sentence here was simple enough. Mexico and Spain were normalizing relations. That word matters. Normalizing. It sounds clean, almost medical, as if the relationship had suffered a fever cold, and now the temperature was finally coming down. After years of distance, the king's return to Mexican soil offered the image both governments needed. Not victory, not surrender, but contact. A handshake, a meeting, a photograph, then a football match. And the World Cup made the timing almost perfect. Because a World Cup is one of the few stages where politics can dress itself as celebration. Crowds arrive for the game. Cameras arrive for the spectacle. Leaders arrive for the ceremony. And if a painful diplomatic message needs to be softened, there are few softer rooms than a stadium full of flags. That is the usefulness of sport. It lets power smile. In Guadalajara, the king could appear not as a monarch arriving to settle a colonial dispute, but as the head of state of a country whose national team was playing on Mexican soil. That is much easier to. It gives everyone something harmless to point at. Football, the match, the anthem, the shirt, the crowd. And yet, while the stadium gave the gesture warmth, the governments gave it weight. Reports at the time described a broader effort to relaunch the Mexico and Spain relationship, including trade, investment, cultural ties, and cooperation. Spain remained one of Mexico's important European partners. Mexico, for Spain, remained a gateway to Latin America. There was money on the table, my dear friend, and money has a wonderful talent for making old enemies remember. They are also business partners. So the official version had more than ceremony behind it. It had strategy. For Mexico, repairing ties with Spain helped widen diplomatic options at a tense moment in global politics. For Spain, returning the crown to Mexico town helped restore influence in a country where history, language, culture, and business had always been entangled. For both, the World Cup offered a camera-friendly bridge. No one had to say the past was solved. They only had to show that the door was open. And perhaps that is why the image worked so well. It allowed everyone to keep their dignity. Mexico's president could receive the king without appearing to abandon the demand for historical recognition. The king could stand in Mexico without uttering a formal apology. Spain could say relations were improving. Mexico could say its position on indigenous peoples and memory had not disappeared. Elegant, careful, useful. If I were arranging the silver for that dinner, I would admire the balance. But I would still count the knives. Because the official story, for all its good posture, depends on one very delicate illusion, that the invitation can be understood without the insult that came before it. And it cannot. There is a loose thread in this velvet. Pull it, and the entire room changes. The same crown welcomed at the World Cup had been deliberately left out of another national ceremony less than 2 years earlier. And that was not an accident of scheduling. That was the first contradiction. The fifth contradiction begins with a date, March 2019. Not a battle, not a coronation, a letter. That is how many modern royal crises begin, by the way. Not with swords, with stationery. Mexico's then president sent a message to the Spanish king and to the Pope. The request was not small. He wanted recognition of the abuses committed during the Spanish conquest, and he wanted apologies to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Now, listen carefully to the shape of that request. It was not only about the 16th century. If it had been only about the past, it would have remained in books, conferences, and museums. The reason it became dangerous is that it asked a living institution to answer for a dead empire. That is where palaces become nervous. A dead empire can be studied. A living crown can be embarrassed. Spain rejected the demand, firmly, publicly. The Spanish government argued that events from 500 years earlier could not be judged in that way, and that the shared history between Spain and Mexico should be approached with a constructive spirit. That was the polished answer. But polished answers can still leave splinters. Because in Mexico, the unanswered letter did not disappear. It became a symbol, a piece of paper that said, in effect, "We asked the old crown to acknowledge the wound, and the old crown declined." Do you see the danger? A letter can become a witness, and a witness can outlive the room where it was ignored. For years, the dispute sat there, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, but it sat there. Then came 2024. The incoming president prepared to take office. World leaders and foreign representatives were invited. Diplomatic protocol began arranging itself in the usual careful lines. But the king was not invited. The reason was not hidden. Mexico's president pointed back to the 2019 letter and to the fact that the king had not answered. The message was unmistakable. If the crown had remained silent when Mexico asked for recognition, then Mexico would not reward that silence with a front-row seat at the inauguration of its new president. This is the moment the story changes. Because suddenly, the debate was no longer an argument for historians. It became protocol, seating, attendance, representation, the kind of quiet punishment palaces understand very well. The Spanish government reacted sharply. It called the exclusion unacceptable and chose not to send a delegation to the inauguration. So the wound that began as a dispute over memory turned into a diplomatic absence visible to the world. A missing chair. Never underestimate a missing chair. In a palace, absence can speak more loudly than an insult. And that is why the 2026 invitation is so strange. Less than 2 years after the king was left out of the president's inauguration, the same monarch was invited into the orbit of Mexico's World Cup. The same crown that had been kept away from one national ceremony could now appear at another public stage, larger, brighter, and watched by far more people. That does not happen by accident. Something had shifted. Not everything. Do not mistake movement for resolution. The past had not been, the conquest had not become painless. Indigenous memory had not been repaired by a stadium ticket. But the door had opened. And the question is, what key turned in the lock? That is the first contradiction in the archive. In 2024, the silence of the crown made the king too heavy to invite. In 2026, the presence of that same crown became useful enough to receive. My dear friend, when a palace changes its answer that quickly, I do not first ask who smiled. I ask what became necessary. Because if the letter could keep a king away from a presidential inauguration, and a World Cup could help bring him back, then this story is no longer about sport. It is about how power manages shame. And before we open the next, in this folder, there is another file I should place on the table. One about the psychology of crowns that survive by learning exactly how much to admit. And that is why I keep certain files separate. Because one episode can show us the gesture, but a dossier shows us the mechanism. If you want to go deeper into the private machinery of crowns, I have prepared The Shadow of the Throne, a psychological dossier on the true cost of the crown. It is not a list of dates. It is a closer look at the patterns that keep returning in royal power. Isolation, fear of exposure, public image, family pressure, silence, paranoia, and the careful art of admitting just enough to survive. You will find it in the first line of the description and in the pinned comment. Consider it the next folder on the table. But for now, let us return to this one. Because if shame was being managed, the next question is simple. What changed between the missing chair in 2024 and the open door in 2026? The first key was not the World Cup. It was a word: abuses. In March 2026, the king made a rare acknowledgement that abuses had been committed during Spain's colonial past in the Americas. Not a full, formal apology. Not the kind of sentence Mexico had asked for in 2019. But enough to change the temperature of the room. That distinction is everything. A palace does not always open the gate by surrendering. Sometimes it opens the gate by moving one hinge. Recognition is not apology. But recognition can be used where apology is still too dangerous. And for a crown, that difference is not semantic. It is survival. If the king had said nothing, the old silence would have remained intact. If he had issued a full apology, the political consequences in Spain might have become heavier than the crown wanted to carry. But a rare acknowledgement of abuses created a narrow passage, enough for Mexico to say, no, something had moved, not enough for Spain to say the crown had been placed on trial. That was the first clue. The second was cultural. Around this same thaw, Spain and Mexico began placing more public weight on indigenous memory, especially through cultural gestures, exhibitions, and official language about pain, injustice, and historical recognition. In one sense, this was overdue. In another, it was diplomatic craftsmanship. Because culture can say things politics cannot yet survive. An exhibition can open a door that a government statement keeps locked. A museum can carry the word injustice into public view without forcing a king to kneel before a microphone. A curator can place indigenous women, memory, and colonial paint into a room where ministers and monarchs can stand nearby and call it dialogue. I do not say that cynically. Not entirely. Cultural recognition can matter. Symbols matter because people live inside them. A portrait can lie for centuries. A corrected caption can begin, slowly, to tell the truth. But symbols also have a habit, that's of becoming furniture. They can make a room look honest before the house itself has changed. So the question remains, was this recognition the beginning of repair, or the minimum price of re-entry? The third clue was governmental. The rewarming did not depend only on the king. It involved Spain's prime minister, Mexico's president, and a wider effort to restart the bilateral relationship. Reports described meetings, warmer hands, language, and a desire to move past the diplomatic freeze. By April 26, Mexico's president and Spain's prime minister had met. By June, the king and Mexico's president stood together in Mexico. That sequence matters. First government to government, then crown to president, then stadium. That is not random choreography. That is protocol learning to walk before it dances. And the fourth clue was the World Cup itself. A World Cup gives governments a very particular gift. It lets them make political gestures inside a celebration that belongs to everyone. If the same meeting had happened in a cold diplomatic hall, the toning, padding colonial dispute would have filled the room immediately. But place it beside football, and the air changes. The cameras have something else to film. The public has something else to discuss. The invitation can be presented as sporting courtesy, even while everyone serious understands the diplomatic meaning underneath. This is why the copa mattered. It did not erase the problem. It gave the problem a costume. A beautiful one, flags, stadium lights, a national team, a royal visitor, a president who could receive him without making the entire day about apology. A king who could appear in Mexico without entering the country under the single headline of colonial guilt. Power loves a mixed occasion, my dear friend. A mixed occasion lets everyone choose the story they prefer. The football public could see football. The diplomats could see football. The Spanish crown could see restored access. The Mexican government could see recognition without capitulation. And indigenous communities, depending on whom you ask, might see either an overdue opening or another elegant performance in which their pain gave moral weight to someone else's ceremony. That is the trouble with symbols. They can heal, they can also absorb. By the time the king arrived in Mexico, the lock had not been broken, it had been oiled. The door could open because each side had found a way to call. Ask the movement something different. Spain could call it friendship. Mexico could call it dignity. The crown could call it continuity. The cameras could call it history. But that raises the next question. Who needed to act this version of the story to become believable? Because in every palace, when a door opens after years of silence, someone has paid for the key. The truth is expensive, not always because it is hidden, sometimes because too many people need it to arrive in a shape they can afford. That is what happened here. For Mexico,
the thaw with Spain was useful.
Very useful. Mexico's president could not simply abandon the demand for recognition. If she had done that, she would have looked as if Mexico's historical dignity could be traded for a handshake and a football match. That would have been politically dangerous and morally thin. But she also could not build a foreign policy out of permanent refusal. Countries have memories, yes. They also have ports, investors, summits, trade, migration, cultural institutions, and diplomatic needs that do not pause, because history is unresolved. Mexico could insist on dignity while still reopening the door. In fact, that was the stronger position. Receive the king not as a forgiven father, but as a guest entering a house where the old question had not been withdrawn. That gave Mexico something valuable. Control of the frame. Mexico could say, "We did not forget. We did not pretend the letter never existed. We made the issue visible enough that the crown had to move." Now, whether that movement was enough is another matter. But in politics, even an incomplete admission can become a tool. Spain needed the story too. For Madrid, the rupture had become convenient. Spain and Mexico share language, business, cultural networks, migration ties, academic exchange, publishing, finance, diplomacy. These are not romantic ties. They are practical ones. And practical ties present symbolic blockades. The Spanish government did not need the colonial argument to define every meeting with Mexico. It needed a way to move forward without accepting a version of history that would be politically explosive at home. That is where the carefully measured recognition helped. Spain could acknowledge pain. Spain could speak of injustice. Spain could warm the relationship. But Spain could still avoid a full formal apology from the crown. Again, the hinge moves. The gate opens. No one says the whole wall has fallen. For the monarchy, the stakes were even more delicate. A king is not merely a man in a suit at a diplomatic. He is a container. He carries continuity. That is the purpose of monarchy. It turns a country into a family story, a legal office into a bloodline, a public institution into a symbol that appears older than politics. That is also the problem. When history asks a monarchy to answer for empire, it is not asking a prime minister to explain policy. It is asking the symbol to admit that the old portrait was painted over suffering. No crown enjoys that. A crown prefers ceremony. Ceremony gives the symbol room to breathe. It lets the king be seen beside flags, presidents, stadiums, applause, and national teams. It does not force the whole meaning of the visit into one word: apology. So the World Cup helped the crown. It gave the king a public reason to be in Mexico that was not only colonial memory. And FIFA, of course, needed nothing so dark. The tournament needed spectacle. It needed global attention. It needed host cities shining, flags moving, dignitaries arriving, stadiums becoming little theaters of world unity. A royal visit was useful there, too. It made the event feel larger than sport, but still safely wrapped in sport. Everyone had a reason to let the story work. That does not mean everyone was lying. This is the dangerous part. A story can be useful and still contain truth. Mexico and Spain may truly have wanted a better relationship. The king's acknowledgement may truly have mattered. Mexico's president may truly have seen an opening to discuss indigenous peoples and historical memory at a higher level. The meeting may truly have been cordial. Power is rarely clean enough to be dismissed as pure theater, but it is rarely innocent enough to be accepted at face value. And then there are the indigenous communities, whose memory gave the entire dispute its moral force. They needed something different from everyone else. Not a clean photograph, not a relaunch of trade, not a clever diplomatic formula. They needed recognition that did not evaporate after the cameras left. They needed language that did not turn pain into background music for elite reconciliation. They needed the story to remain attached to land, language, violence, survival, and historical repair. And that is where the case becomes uncomfortable, because the same gesture can serve many masters. For Mexico, it can be dignity. For Spain, repair. For the monarchy, continuity. For the World Cup, spectacle. For indigenous memory, perhaps a first opening. Or perhaps another performance using an old wound to make a modern ceremony feel profound. I will not pretend to know what every community saw in that moment. That would be arrogance wearing gloves. But I can say this: the usefulness of a story does not make it false. It makes it worth examining. So before we decide whether the invitation was reconciliation or theater, we must separate what we know from what we suspect. The servant does not invent what is missing from the tray. He shows you exactly which glass is empty. I will not pretend the room is brighter than it is. That is a temptation in stories like this. You find a photograph, a date, a silence, a diplomatic gesture, and suddenly the mind wants a verdict. It wants the ribbon tied. It wants the butler to step forward and say, with perfect certainty, who lied, who yielded, who won, and who was used. Real history is less obedient. So let us place the glasses on the tray one by one. Here is what we know. We know that in 2019, the former president asked the Spanish crown and the Vatican to. We recognize and apologize for abuses committed during the conquest. We know Spain rejected that demand. We know the issue did not vanish. We know that in 2024, Mexico's president did not invite the king to her presidential inauguration, and the exclusion was tied directly to the unanswered 2019 letter. We know Spain reacted sharply. We know that in 2026, the king made a rare acknowledgement of colonial abuses, but did not issue the full formal apology Mexico had originally requested. That is not a minor distinction. In diplomacy, the difference between we acknowledge and we apologize can be the difference between opening a door and signing a confession. We know that Mexico then invited the king into the orbit of the World Cup, and that he later met Mexico's president at the National Palace before attending from Spain's match in Guadalajara. We know that reports describe the visit as part of a broader thaw between the two countries. And we know that Mexico's president, after meeting the king, spoke of indigenous peoples' identity and the possibility of bringing that discussion into a wider Ibero-American setting. Those are glasses with water in them. Now for the empty ones. We do not know whether every indigenous community saw the gesture as meaningful. We should not pretend to speak for them. We do not know whether the Spanish monarchy will ever offer the kind of full apology Mexico asked for in 2019. We do not know whether this thaw will produce lasting historical repair or simply better diplomatic manners. And we do not know whether the World Cup softened the wound or merely gave everyone a more attractive stage on which to stand beside it. That is the honest line. But uncertainty does not mean blindness. Even without pretending to know every private intention, we can see the pattern. The crown stayed silent. Mexico made silence costly. Spain moved part of the way. Mexico accepted the movement without calling the matter closed. The World Cup gave everyone a public stage where that partial movement could look like progress. That, my dear friend, is not a conspiracy. It is diplomacy. And diplomacy is often the art of making an unfinished truth acceptable, long enough for the cameras to leave. So what should we call the invitation? A surrender? No. A full conciliation? Not yet. A meaningless football courtesy? Certainly not. The best answer sits somewhere colder and perhaps more interesting. It was a controlled return. A return permitted by a partial admission, softened by sport, supported by economic interest, and haunted by a question no photograph could answer. That question is the one the palace would rather leave in the hallway. But we have come too far to leave it there. If the crown returned without kneeling, what did it actually pay? So what did the crown pay? Not a full apology. Not surrender. Not the kind of public repentance that would have satisfied everyone who wanted a clear moral sentence from Spain. The crown paid something smaller and more useful. It paid with movement. It paid by allowing the old silence to crack. It paid by acknowledging abuses where denial had once sounded cleaner. It paid by entering Mexico not as if nothing had happened, but after enough had happened that Mexico could receive the king without looking as if it had forgotten the letter. That is the best reading of the case. The invitation was not the end of the colonial argument. It was the price of reopening the diplomatic door without closing the historical wound. That may sound unsatisfying. It should, because the history underneath this gesture is not a courtly misunderstanding. It is not two cousins arguing over seating at the dinner. It is the memory of conquest, extraction, forced conversion, racial hierarchy, destroyed worlds, and surviving communities, and a modern state still deciding how to speak about all of it without turning memory into a museum label. A World Cup cannot solve that. No anthem can solve that. No photograph can solve that. But a photograph can show us how power tries to live with what it cannot solve. That is what we are looking at. A controlled return. Mexico did not pretend the past was gone. Spain did not give the full apology. The king did not arrive as a defeated symbol. Mexico's president did not receive him as if 2019 and 24 had never happened. Instead, each side accepted a narrow corridor. A corridor is not a home, but it is a way through. And diplomacy often happens in corridors. I have spent enough imaginary hours in palaces to tell you this. The most important conversations rarely happen in the grand hall. The hall is for photographs. The corridor is where the face changes. The corridor is where someone whispers, "How much can we say?" The corridor is where history becomes language that can be survived. In this case, the survivable language was not forgiveness. It was thaw. It was cordiality. It was recognition. It was dialogue. Those are powerful words. Soft words. Words with polished shoes. But careful words can still move heavy furniture. The deeper point is this. The Spanish crown did not need to conquer anything in 2026. It needed permission to be seen again in a place where its historical meaning had become politically uncomfortable. And Mexico did not need to humiliate the crown. It needed proof that silence had become more costly than acknowledgement. That is the exchange. Visibility for movement, access for recognition, a royal visit for a partial admission, a stadium for a wound. And if that sounds cold, my dear friend, that is because power often is cold. It does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrives with a seating plan, a guest list, and a sentence both sides can defend. This is why I do not read the invitation as simple reconciliation. Reconciliation suggests a wound brought into the light, named fully, and treated with enough honesty that both sides can stand differently afterward. This was not that. Not yet. But I also do not read it as empty theater. The crown did move. Mexico did extract movement. The subject of indigenous peoples did enter the official conversation. The king did stand in a place where, less than 2 years earlier, his absence had made a political point. That matters. The question is whether it matters enough. And there, the file resists closure. Because the cost of this crown was not paid by the king alone. It was not paid only by Spain's diplomats. It was not paid only by the president's political calculation. The oldest cost was paid by the people whose history made the entire dispute morally necessary. That is why the World Cup setting is so striking. The stadium could make the return look joyful. The palace could make it look dignified. The press dome could make it look normal. But underneath all three, the same question remained. Can an empire's descendant be welcomed back without the empire's wound being healed? My answer is this. Yes, it can be welcomed back. That is what happened. But welcome is not absolution. A chair can be offered, a hand can be shaken, a match can be attended, a relationship can thaw. And still, somewhere beneath the carpet, the old floorboards remember the weight. The invitation worked because it gave everyone enough to continue, not enough to finish. That is why the crown returned without kneeling. It paid with acknowledgement. It paid with presence. It paid with the quiet admission that silence had become too expensive. But the debt beneath the crown? That remains older than the stadium lights, and far harder to settle. I can close the file, I cannot close the question. That is the difficulty with old crowns. They can leave the room, and somehow the room still feels occupied. The chair returns to its place. The flags are folded. The cameras are packed away. The stadium empties. Someone sweeps the floor after the match. And still, something remains. Not proof of peace. Not proof of guilt. A pressure in the air. The photograph from 2026 will survive. It will sit in archives, articles, timelines, and official memory as evidence that Mexico and Spain found a way to stand together again. That is not nothing. In diplomacy, even standing together can be work. But the photograph cannot tell us what was settled, only what was staged. And I do not use that word as an insult. Staging is part of power. Coronations are staged. State visits are staged. Funerals, weddings, apologies, military parades, royal portraits, even handshakes in a corridor. All staged. The question is not whether the scene was staged. The question is what the staging was trying to carry. In this case, it was carrying a great deal. It carried the weight of a letter from 2019. It carried the empty chair of 2024. It carried a rare acknowledgement in 2026. It carried the World Cup, that enormous, glowing machine of flags and feeling. It carried trade, reputation, diplomacy, and the wish of two governments to move without appearing to forget. And beneath all of that, it carried the memory of people who were not merely symbols in someone else's reconciliation. That is where I leave the question with you. Because perhaps you see the invitation as progress, a small, imperfect step, but a real one. Perhaps you believe nations do not prepare history by waiting for perfect sentences. They begin with imperfect gestures, and then they are judged by what follows. That is a fair reading. Or perhaps you see something colder, a monarchy learning how to return, a government learning how to accept partial movement, and a World Cup turning a colonial wound into a ceremony bright enough to soften the edges. That is also a fair reading. The palace would prefer you choose do not. Sit with it. Was this reconciliation? Was it strategy? Was it a necessary beginning? Or was it simply a crown discovering that, under the right lights, even an unpaid debt can look like diplomacy? I know what I think. I think the door opened. I also think the bill remained on the table. And that is often how power survives, not by paying everything it owes, but by paying just enough to be invited back. So tell me, my dear friend, when Spain's king walked back into Mexico's story during the World Cup, did you see a wound beginning to heal? Or a crown learning how to stand beside the wound without touching it? Leave your answer below, my dear friend. Not a slogan, a judgment. Was this a real beginning or a beautiful piece of protocol? I read those comments carefully because this channel is not a crowd shouting at the gates. It is a quieter circle. People who know that a crown is never just gold and a photograph is never just a photograph. And if you want to go deeper into that private archive, the shadow of the throne is waiting for you in the first line of the description and in the pinned comment. Think of it as the file I cannot fully open in one episode. The hidden cost of royal power, the loneliness behind ceremony, the fear behind image, the family pressure behind public grace, the silence that keeps old houses standing longer than they deserve. If this story gave you someone to argue with, send it to them. If you want the next door opened, stay close. The palace is never short of locked rooms, and every crown, even one carried into a stadium, still has a cost.